There are many different kinds of spaces within any given workplace. We're going to talk about the common office type building. We're going to review the common spaces that you see here, and then we will spend more of our time in the office spaces, the private offices and the open offices. Our first impression of any workplace happens in the main entrance and the lobby. It has to be a welcoming and safe space, but should also be consistent with the client's branding and image. After the lobby, we would normally head out to a reception space. So it has to be easy to find, and usually we designate reception spaces with some degree of lighting. Now, the lighting needs to be bright to demarcate the space, but we should be mindful of occupants, both visitors, but especially the receptionist, that it shouldn't be too glary. In this office space that we renovated, the receptionist before the renovation was sitting under a series of recessed downlights and was a cause of many headaches and a lot of eye strain. So in this case, what we did is we provided under cabinet lighting and over cabinet lighting. And the only direct source of light is this recessed linear, but it's shielded from her view in this case by this beam. Corridor lighting typically is not mandated to be very high in terms of light level. There just typically has to be enough for wayfinding, and often codes which are, relate to your jurisdiction will dictate like a minimum required for egress. Now, sometimes we can provide some visual interest. For example, even with this fairly, simple linear, but causing these scallops on the wall can break up otherwise a fairly monotonous long corridor. In this corridor, highlighting the art was one of the objectives. So our light levels are a little bit higher, but it certainly makes for a fairly pleasurable experience. Layers of light is what will give you the flexibility that you need to light a boardroom. In this example, we show a task light over the table for any tabletop tasks. And as you've heard me say many times before, we light those verticals. So we've got the two end walls illuminated with these wall washers. But there's also a monitor here for AV presentations. And in that case, we would turn off those wall washers and most likely, at the very least, dim that light over the table. But we would engage, there is a cove light that is very discreetly mounted at the top of the window. And it's a really nice extrusion. It's an integrated fixture, and that will provide us some uplight in a case of wanting to do an AV presentation, which will give you some nice light, ambient light, but not cause any glare or reflections on the AV monitor. The goal in washrooms, of course, is to ensure that you have enough light for hygiene at the sinks as well as for grooming. But it's also important to make sure that our bathroom stalls feel fairly welcoming. There's nothing worse than opening a bathroom stall door and you're greeted by darkness. So in this case, what we did is we have a grazer at the walls to ensure that that stall is nicely lit and welcoming. We can take a utilitarian approach to lighting stairwells, especially if they are back of house and not being used very often or only for emergencies. But in this case, the stairwell was leading down to the parkade in a fairly large retail mall. And so we knew there was going to be a lot of traffic. So with a little creativity, and we considered all views, we came up with just a little bit of a twist on the lighting for that stairwell. In this case, there is a space between the back end of this landing and the wall behind us. And this is a stairwell in an office space that is used quite often by staff to get between two floors. And so we took an interesting approach, a different approach, which was to use a linear tucked in between that landing and the wall. And we grazed the wall up, and what you don't see here is that their stair goes one level down to exit. And so we provided a downlight component here as well. But we got some really nice shadows and a pretty nice welcoming effect. In this case, we considered the view from the exterior, where we matched the radius of the luminaire with the radius of these landings in front of us. And at the doorways, we put linear fixtures mounted in the walls on both sides. So a little bit unexpected, but it does get a lot of visibility from the street. Now we're going to spend a little bit of time on the office spaces themselves, the workspaces, and consider a number of different elements for those spaces. Now, windows and views are desirable in an office, but daylighting really needs to be considered early on in the design process. And the reason for that is because while daylight gives you some natural light that you can use, it's also a source of heat and glare, especially from a window like this, which faces west. Now, if you'll notice the windows, the lower windows in this case are electrochromic, so they turn darker depending on how much light is hitting them in response to the daylight. So if there's a lot of sun outside, those lower windows can get quite dark. So what's done on the upper windows here is there is a light redirecting film in these windows. So as you can see, they appear bright, but opaque. And here's an image of what that light is doing on the walls. So it is in fact redirecting the light, sorry, not to the walls, but to the ceiling. So even when these lowers can get fairly dark on a bright day, we're still letting some of that daylight in and making it useful. Now we know that electrical lighting can impact our circadian rhythm. But what I want to note here really is that it's not just as simple as applying tunable white lights to a space. There's an actual formula. It's like a cocktail of different things that can have that impact on our circadian entrainment. And that includes everything from the spectrum of the light source, the quantity of light, the distance the occupants are to that light source, how much time they're exposed, etc. The important point is that it can be done, but you have to determine it through a formula. Now, it's been shown that occupant satisfaction with their workspace can have an impact on productivity. So our ability to control various aspects in our workspace, such as the temperature and lighting, improves our sense of satisfaction. And so this points to just another benefit of providing lighting controls, because you've probably heard the statistic, whereas for every dollar you pay in rent per square foot, you're actually paying $100 for the cost of your people. So productivity improvements are pretty important. Now, of course, there's task lighting. That's the lighting that lets us perform our jobs. And there's different kind of tasks that workers would undertake in an office. So we need to ensure that there's sufficient lighting on the work surface, such as desks and tables, but also that accent lighting for the whiteboard. Now, the video monitor should be visible without any glare. It used to be much more difficult to light for computers in the age when we used to call them VDTs, or video display terminals. So that was many, many years ago, many iterations ago. And we were typically limited to using louvered fixtures that made the ceiling look fairly dark. but would cut the glare in the screen. Now today our monitors are much more forgiving. The glass is better, less reflective, and we can tilt and adjust our screens to help avoid any bright sources. But still important to remember to avoid sources of glare in the monitor's field of view. Now, in addition to task lighting, we have to consider ambient light, and there's different ways to provide ambient light in an office. Of course, there is direct illumination, such as in these images, fixtures that Lightline does supply, and I'm not here to sell those fixtures, but I do really like the edge fixture on the left. It's one of my favorites. I think it's really a creative solution. And one example of how there's many different styles for direct ambient lighting that are effective for lighting as well as aesthetically pleasing. Now, there's been a lot of discussion on what our actual office spaces may look like when people can return to work after this stage of the pandemic. My preliminary thoughts are that social distancing may require us adding maybe a layer of controls, lighting controls, to enable a more granular type of control. So perhaps if there's somebody sitting at this desk today but nobody at this desk for social distancing, that perhaps this fixture could be turned off on those days. So we could maybe use less light. Here's an example of direct ambient illumination using point sources, in this case, wall washers. And what we're doing is we're lighting these walls for the art, but also having the wall be our reflective, source of light, creating some ambient light. We've also got two adjustable downlights, and they're adjustable because it doesn't matter, what the drawing says that here's where the desk is going to go. It may be a few inches here or there, it may be a foot, different. So we like to leave that flexibility to make sure that we will indeed be hitting the task in this case. Ambient lighting can also be created through indirect illumination, such as using pendants that are uplight pendants. Now, in this case, we've used a desk-mounted two-circuit fixture with both uplight and downlight. So you can see them here. So here is the uplight component, and that is being controlled by the building lighting control system using daylight harvesting to determine how much light is actually coming out of that fixture. And the downlight component is the task light, and that is being controlled by the occupant. Now, a few notes about indirect illumination. So number one, it may be less energy efficient. You know that the amount of light you get on a surface is somewhat proportional to the square of the distance from that light source. So when you're using indirect light, we're actually shooting light up before it aims down. So it can be less energy efficient. However, it does produce a much softer light with less glare, and it visually raises the ceiling. And here you can see a combination of both indirect and direct lighting being used. So again, these are the indirect luminaires causing the uplight over here. And these direct light sources are actually mounted about 10 feet on center because we need much less light here for the corridor than we would, say, for any task. Now we get to video conferencing. Well, one prediction is that video conferencing will continue to play a big role in our lives. So we are going to spend a little bit of time on this. Now, the example in this picture, in this image, is from the days when video conferencing was a pretty specialized task, usually only in a boardroom, in a designated video conference room. And it was still the days where finding a dimmable, round fluorescent fixture was still a pretty big deal. So it is fairly old, but the principle of lighting for the video conferencing camera is still the same. So this image shows the lighting in a regular meeting mode. And here we're showing the lighting for video conferencing turn on. In this case, it was the track lighting. And so the goal is, while you need a little bit of light behind you so you can see the background, you need a lot more light on the face, and you can see the difference with that track lighting on. Now, in this case, we have cross-aimed going from both sides. And in those times, the camera actually needed quite a bit of light, a lot more than it does today. And so those were the days when video conference lighting, especially like this, would be very glary for the occupant, but that's pretty well the only way to do it, was light from the front. Well, things have changed, as you know, and cameras are better. And I thought to best demonstrate video conferencing for today's technology, I would take you on a special tour.
Hello everybody, and welcome to my office. So here we have the south wall of my office with the work surface that has task lighting above it. And there's ambient light created by indirect lighting mounted above the uppers. Now on the west wall, I do have a nice big window bringing in lots of daylight, and often the room doesn't need to have the lights on during the day. It's pretty overcast today, but there's still lots of light coming in. Another small layer of light is there's a little bit of accent light on some of the project photos, etc. On the wall, that is by a linear that's just sitting on top of the bookcase. And this is where you usually see me from.
So I'm sitting at my desk, and I have turned off all of the lights in the office, but the window shades are still open. So you can see that there's quite a bit of brightness on one side of my face, and it actually looks better on this side of the face. Now I'm going to shut the blinds and let you see what happens. So look what happens when the blinds are closed too. It's actually quite dark in my office now. I wouldn't be able to do any tasks on my desk, but the camera is trying to compensate, so you probably notice some graininess in the picture, but I am more evenly illuminated. It's pretty amazing what low levels of light the camera will indeed pick up. So that's the good news. So it's interesting to note that I actually look better in the dark than I did with the window open. So now let's see what happens with my handy dandy remote. I'm going to turn on my ambient lighting. And so you can see here that because the light is being reflected from the ceiling, it's almost like a downlight where you're seeing a lot of shadowing, because I'm certainly much better looking than this in person. So you do see the shadows under the nose. So we need to have a little bit more light, and as we mentioned, the lighting should come from the front. So now I'm going to turn on the task lighting in my office. Now, you can see that flash on. What's happening is that task light that is sitting underneath the under cabinet lights is reflecting off the back wall as well as off of the white desk and casting nice even illumination across my face. So that is the best way to light yourself for video conferencing, is to make sure you've got a nice even distribution of light coming from the front or from both sides. Even that would help to try to minimize shadows.
So one last point to make is about trying to mitigate that solar gain, that heat gain from the west sunlight that we do get here. And although we can close the blinds, it still does get pretty warm. And on a nice summer day, the last thing you want to do is be sitting in a room where there's no window effectively. So I happen to love to garden, and this is called a form of natural daylight shading. And what I'm going to try to show you is right about here, in there, those are the stumps from last year's growth. That's a tall bamboo type of grass that will grow, can grow to up to 10 feet. So will end up being about, this high in the window. And we do get some shielding in the lower part, and don't necessarily have to close the blinds all the way in the summer. So that is one technique, is to use things that will grow tall. Another thing that you can use are hops, but they do need to be to have some kind of a trellis or something to climb on, and I didn't want to have to construct that, so the tall grasses work really well for that.
So to summarize what we've just learned, it's important, of course, to illuminate the face from the front or both sides. But I want you to let you know that when I designed the lighting of my office more than 10 years ago, video conferencing was not a consideration, okay? But I got lucky with all that reflected light that I explained. Now, if your situation at home is not ideal, you can try a couple of things. One is move your computer, your monitor, your laptop so that you are actually facing the window. So you will get that even illumination on the face, and that can work at certain times of day and certainly only in the day. The other thing you can do is add a table lamp or two. I think it's important that the lamp is behind the monitor, behind where the camera would see it, but enough that it would be providing that direct light on your face. And it can be diffuse direct light. Again, you saw how sensitive the cameras can be. Normally, when you see me, the exercise bike behind me is pushed out of the way, and I do that to try and look a little more professional. But for the office tour, and these are screenshots from that tour, I decided I was going to keep it real. So we had been using our son's bedroom as our gym while he was away at university. But now that he's back home and safe with us, we had to move the exercise bike to the office and the yoga mats to the living room and the jigsaw puzzles on the dining room table. And I'm sure many of you can relate to what our homes look like in these crazy times. And finally, the last point I'm going to make here is that in order to position myself in the center of the screen, I raise my laptop on a box, as you can see here. The IES handbook, the 9th edition, works great as well. I also lower my chair so that I'm positioned accordingly. So now you know all of my secrets. And on that note, I will come onto the screen and take your questions.